Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I got a bunch of questions here, all of which are from neurotypical wives about their husband with autism spectrum disorder. And these are questions specifically from the NT ladies in my counseling groups, and I thought I would just address them all in one cluster here instead of doing them individually. And so we'll run through here real quick. The first one, she asked, does autism spectrum disorder, does the diagnosis of that change anything? Well, the actual diagnosis doesn't change anything, no. It doesn't change who your husband is or what he can accomplish. It does give him somewhat of a roadmap to the traits that he's likely to experience and some of the treatment strategies to address those traits. But the diagnosis in and of itself doesn't change anything as long as the two of you know that you have communication breakdown and it causes a problem for both of you and you both want to fix it. Then we don't necessarily need to label that anything other than communication difficulties. And the next question is, does ASD level 1 get worse with age? And the answer to that is not likely. Most teens and adults with autism spectrum disorder have less severe symptoms and behaviors as they get older. And that's not to say that all adults on the spectrum get better, but the vast majority of them will. Some of them do get worse with age, but that is almost always the case with the individual who has just excessive amounts of anxiety and depression, and then engages in so much destructive behavior to reduce his anxiety that his symptoms do get worse over time. The next one, can you be slightly autistic? Yeah, there's a spectrum, as you know. There's high functioning, moderate functioning, and low functioning, but even on the high end of the spectrum, which we call high functioning autism, right, there's another smaller spectrum. So that would be like high functioning, high moderate functioning, high low functioning. So there are some people that are so high on the high functioning end of the spectrum that they literally pass under the radar, and as far as everybody else is concerned, they're neurotypical. And the next question is, what are some of the red flags that I need to be aware of that may indicate my husband has autism spectrum disorder, as my suspicions lead me in the direction to believe that he does. Basically, if he has difficulty interpreting what you think and feel, if he has trouble interpreting your facial expressions, body language, and any other social cues that you give off, and if he has difficulty regulating his emotions, in other words, you witness shutdowns and or meltdowns, or we could also maybe call them adult temper tantrums, low frustration tolerance, these things would definitely indicate that a diagnosis, if he wants to seek a diagnosis, might be appropriate. What triggers my husband with Asperger's syndrome meltdowns? What triggers his meltdowns? Usually that has to do with sensory sensitivities, changes in routine, anxiety, communication difficulties that result in anxiety as well. So remember that people on the autism spectrum have this thing called mind blindness, which means they have a lot of unpredictability in their world, and so they try to make it as predictable as possible, and that comes through the use of a lot of routine and structure, and they don't like change as a result. And so when any changes to his routine come along, that is a trigger for a meltdown. But really, the changes in routine is just one form of anxiety producing events. So the big picture here is anxiety is the main trigger for meltdowns, and there's different components that could be subsumed under anxiety. Those would be like sensory sensitivities, changes in routine, communication difficulties, and so on. Can a person with Asperger's feel love? Well, I would hope that we wouldn't even have to answer that question. Your husband with, in this case, Asperger's, he's not an automaton or a hologram or a robot, although I have some NT wives that say her husband does come off like Spock from Star Trek. But of course they feel love. They don't necessarily display their emotions much. So he would have empathy, but he may not have displayed empathy. And what I mean by that is he may not behave in certain ways or say certain things that convey empathy to the level that you would want. But he certainly can feel love and can certainly express empathy. In fact, in some cases, believe it or not, the ASD individual is so empathic that he has found from a very early age that it's just too painful to feel that empathy. He feels too closely the pain of others, and that is so anxiety-provoking that he literally shuts his feelings off. And so there it does appear that he's not a very loving, caring, sensitive, empathic person. And the next NT wife asks, what are the main symptoms to look for? Well, I touched on that earlier, but some of the main signs would be if your, in this case, husband, I assume, finds it hard to understand what you're thinking or feeling, if he tends to get very anxious about social situations, if he finds it hard to make friends and prefers to be by himself over there somewhere engaged in his special interest away from family, if he often seems blunt, rude, or not interested in others without meaning to, that would be a main sign. And if he finds it hard to say how he feels and finds it hard to comprehend how you feel, those I think would be the main signs of autism spectrum disorder. Next, does ASD cause anxiety? Absolutely, 100%. I don't know anybody, and I've been working in this field for a while, who has Asperger's or high-functioning autism that does not have anxiety. There's varying degrees. Some have really high anxiety, some have moderate. But if they have super low anxiety and they've been diagnosed with ASD, they've probably been misdiagnosed. And the last question I'll entertain today is, do the symptoms of Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism ever go away? Sometimes it's possible that the traits outlive their lifetime, and so to speak, so some of the traits that the individual may have exhibited as a teenager, for example, he's no longer exhibiting those. So research does in the past several years has shown that children can outgrow diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. In other words, their symptomology has lessened or decreased so dramatically as they've grown into the teenage years and young adult years that if they were to go back and get retested, they actually would just fall right out, just outside of the zone of being on the autism spectrum. So, and a lot of that has to do with early intervention, making sure that the child is taught social skills and gets all the other interventions that are needed at a very young age. So there's links below this video for more resources, and don't hesitate to email me if I can answer your question. Thank you. This is Mark Hutten, AdultAsperger'sChat.com.